Welcome to another episode of the Supply and Chain podcast. I'm your host, Ali Raza, and today I am here with Zukisani Madalane. Zukisani hails from South Africa. He's been in the supply chain for many years. I'm really excited to sit down with him and learn about his journey and what he's working on today. So, first of all, good afternoon, Zukisani, or good morning. What time is it over there in South Africa, and what city are you in?
It's 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon. I'm based in Johannesburg at the moment.
Excellent. So, Zukisani, you have a very unique background, and we've met through the other co-pod host Anzer, right? So, just tell me about how you got in the supply chain. Why are you still in supply chain? Is a big question a lot of people have. But just tell me about your story, how you ended up going through so many different continents, solving so many different types of supply chain problems.
Well, I have a background in computer science. So, as a graduate, I started my first job in a retail company, which is an e-commerce company based in Cape Town in South Africa. That's when I got first introduced into supply chain, particularly like from an IT applications perspective. Prior to that, when growing up, my father owned a retailer, to say for instance, where he was able to purchase goods to sell into his rural community, and we would be the ones like delivering the stock to the various customers. So I have a huge sort of a long background within supply chain based from my family, but also from a professional perspective, it's working at a retailer in South Africa and then moving to the UK, working for a chemical manufacturer.
Yeah, so talk to me about moving to the UK, right? So that's a very interesting background. I did not know you come from a retail family, but how did you end up in UK in chemicals of all industries? Were you in the chemical business before on the retail side, or it just was the first opportunity out the door?
It was the first opportunity out the door. So moving to the UK, it was after the MIT supply chain program that I attended with ANZA. After that, I applied for various jobs and roles, and that was one of the first opportunities I received to move abroad. With that, it was also based on moving to the business side in terms of the process improvement role. So that was sort of the first opportunity I got. It was the first time I'd been exposed to sort of the chemical manufacturing industry, as previously I had been heavily involved within the retail industry, particularly in the e-commerce space.
Makes a lot of sense. I come from the chemical industry, and obviously I'm no longer in it. So talk to me about computer science, IT. Why did you choose also to be on the software side of the house, right? Because obviously there's the operation side, but the digital side, what's going on? What's the promise that's getting everybody attracted to that side versus the hands-on stuff that we should be doing, especially if like someone like me who went to school for chemical engineering.
From IT side, so I had a huge interest within IT from just growing up, and then I just decided to, like, particularly as a graduate, just to look into a big company in South Africa to just work on their systems. My first exposure was effectively into the retailing systems, particularly like planning, merchandising, and also like warehousing. That's when I got hugely invested within sort of like IT stream, understanding like the different applications that were utilized. As the first company I worked for had about 40 applications utilized within sort of supply chain in particular. And then within that, I got sort of the exposure between IT, business, and processes, particularly the operational environment. I saw some huge gaps within that. Hence, when I decided to go to that MIT program, I decided to shift towards understanding from a process perspective or operational perspective, what can I actually contribute to sort of bring that alignment between IT, because you'd see like multiple applications and a lot of issues which were actually not addressing some of the challenges that were being faced by the business.
So on that note, how clean? What is the situation on the retail side, right? Because many people want to get into the retail IT side. They think everything's being tracked by a computer vision system, and everything's every data point is clean. It's coming back. What is it like growing up on the retail side of the business, right, and the family, and realizing what the gaps are from a digital perspective? And you mentioned the 14 systems. What are the realities of that space, right? Because I think a lot of people in supply chain, they work upstream in procurement, and they never really see the demand signal. So I mean, the holy grail for a lot of people is like, hey, if we can get the demand signal, we can actually fulfill the demand. But what are the realities at that very end point that not a lot of people have experience with?
Well, the like with that endpoint, like within retail, what you find is there's multiple applications. Let's say, for this instance, about 40 applications, whether it's allocation systems, whether it's a forecasting system or your warehousing solutions, which was we had to manage. And majority of time, it was different systems from different companies, and which had a lot of issues in terms of data integration. There's a lot of data. Also, business users didn't know how to utilize the applications. There were sort of incorrect configurations in terms of like reorder points and everything else, which was causing a lot of stock being actually in the warehouse, not being sold. Then you had to sort of mark down stock, which was a huge issue in that space. So in the background, there's a lot of challenges, particularly also with legacy systems. So and also like adoption of new systems, which actually pile up into that IT stack, and also which also leads to like lack of talent also, which are able to manage that. So within the retail space, there's a lot of trying to manage all this complex environment, complex IT applications for the business, and with the changing business requirements, which will want to implement new technologies in the space, the talent that actually is not trained to actually manage all these various layers, and also the older systems, legacy systems, which are impacted by people who have left the company and there's a lack of understanding of what's happening. So there's a lot of mess around trying to patch things to get things out to store and to the customer, and a lot of sort of firefighting, even within the IT department, trying to get things right. So there's a lot of
There's a lot of problems in general, or I mean, so I guess the big question then is how do you get to these 14 systems to that point, right? It's like how did 14 systems get there to begin with? And you mentioned just patching everything up. Like, what is the solution? I guess the $1 million question, or even in some cases, it's the $100 million question. Is how do you sort of go about fixing it? So, like, how does a company, say, like we're talking about South Africa, get to 14 different systems with users on different systems and nothing in sync, and then someone like yourself coming in and trying to consolidate everything, put it all on a single system of truth, and clean up the demand signal.
yeah. One of the reasons some companies they reach that point is business leaders sometimes go to conferences and you get approached by various companies or startups. You find this might be an interesting solution, then you make a decision to actually incorporate this within the IT applications. In other instances, people reach out to various companies because they have a huge challenge in terms of, let's say, managing their inventory, and people just make a decision that this application can actually resolve some of the challenges that we have. The main driver for the company I used to work for was because it was a huge company managing like various categories of items, which was clothing, homeware, and accessories, effectively. And with the different businesses, there were different business leaders with different objectives on their end, and each and every one of them wanted different applications to run for their particular business, but with the one singular sort of IT organization trying to run it. So those are the sort of challenges and why you'd find that there's a lot of applications sitting here that you would need, as an IT team, you'd need to manage and try to get correct based on all these different priorities each business has, because one business has a different objective from the other one, but they sit under the same company effectively.
So to your point, right? Then what is the roadmap? Because it's a bit of the chicken and the egg problem, right? Where operations like I got to solve inventory problems and I found a solution and this is it. I got to use this and we'll save $2 million, or we'll get 3% more fill rates, whatever the metric is that they're going for. And then there's obviously IT that's like, look, we need to make sure everything is structured so that one day when all the systems align and all the stars align, like we'll have a system that can basically run everything seamlessly, right? So in your opinion, like what is the right way, or how do you get out of that mess is one of the big questions everybody else is asking right now, especially like, as you know, private equity backed companies that might come and acquire a whole bunch of different locations, and then they suddenly have all these different systems, different routes, different vendors, and then they suddenly need to fix that math problem.
Yeah. I think for my end, I think the biggest challenge would be first addressing the process problem prior to actually implementing a IT solution, understanding what your process is and what actually is the problem statement you're trying to resolve. Particularly with companies, let's say with multiple entities within it, understanding like what is the core objective or vision for that company, what are we trying to achieve, trying to align the IT people with that, because in some instances you might find that IT people don't understand the business value for certain products, not in the landscape, and also just being able to understand the maturity model of your company, where you at with this uh, as a company based on your application layers, how are you able to simplify in order to get as much value, and also where do you need to improve, and then looking at the landscape in terms of like your vision, how to map out that, because there are a lot of tools that are out there that can resolve your problem, but effectively based on your vision, like what is the correct tool for you to utilize. But I also think at certain aspects it would be with the data that you have, as big companies, because they might have existed for a number of years. What are you able to do with the data you have, even though it might be dirty or clean, to actually drive effective decisions within that company? So I think that's quite an important alignment as organizations to determine like what are the decision points that we have, how are we able to simplify the current processes, and be able to define that and have that strategic objective or vision for the company.
And to your point, right? So a lot of people talk about that IT doesn't understand business value. They understand. I mean, they clearly understand the data value because they won't give it to you.
Mm.
But talk to me about why you think IT. I mean, this has just been a thing that I think unfairly thrown on to the IT people who, obviously understand. Many of them understand how their business does run, right? I mean, there's not all of them are completely detached from the day to day. Some of them actually come through operations, and then they make the switch over to the IT side because they realize that, hey, this is like the system that's running the operations, and someone needs to be sitting there to make sure it's like at least the data and how it's being synced is correct. So why do you think that there's this myth about IT people not understanding the business value? Because you came through operations and IT. Clearly you understand the business value, right? Because you've seen both sides. But how does, like, say, an IT professional address this, right? Because this typically gets thrown back to them saying, hey, you don't understand what the business wants. And there's always this gap between operations and IT saying, hey, you don't understand what the business wants. And they're saying, hey, you don't understand what the future is going to be. And then nothing typically moves forward. So from your perspective, like, why is this, I guess, myth or this thought around that IT just doesn't understand the business value?
Yeah, but when you talk about the business value, I think within the IT perspective, they understand like the opportunities that the business actually wants to pursue, and also it's not well communicated by the business why you actually want to pursue certain opportunities as a business and what that vision is, and also there is a sort of lack of understanding of process, even from the business side and the IT side, because you'd find when things are not working, the user expects a system to work in a particular way, but it has actually been designed in a particular way, which is sort of contrary to what the expectation is. So there's always this misalignment in terms of that the process, which impacts in understanding like what opportunities are out there and what is your system able to actually achieve based on how you've configured it based on this process. So with the attrition sort of like in the workforce, there's a lack of understanding like in the broader perspective of these systems that have been developed, how do they actually work? Are they actually able to achieve those objectives that you initially set? Are they actually even now changed objectives effectively? And what would that entail to effectively update your IT system in order to be able to sort of align with the business objectives? So I think that's the main thing. Like when we speak of business objectives, the IT people actually just want to ensure that the system is stable, because we actually measured on stable systems, the uptime, you're able to work like with a 95% or 90% availability. It's not about trying to pursue business objectives or business opportunities that are out there. So that's sort of also this misalignment between the IT and also like the business itself.
Copy. So yeah, I mean, IT typically, and we're running to this right now, where their job is to make sure the system works 99.9% of the time with no mistakes. I mean, that's what they're judged on. But how hard really is it for like someone to define the operational process and say like, hey, I want the IT process to overlay onto this. I want the databases and the systems to completely one-to-one match this. Why does that not occur? Is it just a different way of thinking? Or to your point, the goal is just, hey, we picked a system. It needs to be running 100% on time and full. They're responsible for the architecture running. Whether the data is right or wrong coming in and that is an operational problem, right? That's no longer an IT problem. if you don't input the data correctly, nothing the system can do to fix the data, right? Unless you have some guardrails or some sort of system that sort of knocks it back and says, "Hey, fix this number," or say code that you put in.
Yeah, I'll just bring a story just to relay like what I mean by like this lack of understanding of the business value. I remember we implemented a WMS system, and there were a lot of prior to implementing it. What had been communicated by the IT person is that actually there's a data issue within the legacy database that we're trying to move from. We need to do a stock take, but the timelines being given by the business leaders was sort of limited, and they like we need to implement within like a short span of time. What was when the implementation happened, there were a lot of issues with that because the data was incorrect, things were being moved incorrectly, and it took about 3 months to resolve the issue. What was the challenge from the IT perspective was actually communicating based on the process, like the impact of the incorrect stock data. This is the amount, this is the impact, and effectively the monetary value. And if you move into implementing this solution without actually ensuring that stock is where it's at when we move live, your system is actually not operating. Because I remember back then, like within the first week, we couldn't get stock in and we couldn't get stock out. So effectively, that warehouse was down for a couple of weeks. So I think even though IT people understand, say, their data, understand the issues related to like bad quality, but being able to communicate like this is the actual impact to the business, which would lead to this like this is the monetary value, which would actually decrease your revenues. Business people actually would not listen to you because they think like it's a simple copy and paste, effectively.
It makes sense. And you mentioned you implemented WMS. What other systems have you had experience implementing, and what do you think have been the pros and cons or challenges of putting in on the system? And to your story, right? If the data is not clean and not organized, regardless of the system you put in, it seems like you need to put in some extra work before you can get whatever you invested in, whether a functional system or holistic system, to work. So, what else do you have experience implementing outside of WMS and ERP? I guess.
I've implemented JDA solution, a sort of consolidated environment, so moving 9 different companies into a consolidated environment. I've worked or implemented planning systems, AIM planning system. I've worked with various merchandising tools like JDA allocations and also like sizing tools within the retail space. So there are a couple of tools that we've actually implemented. Majority of them were also just upgrading the legacy software to a new tool. So I've got like a scope like within sort of like the supply planning tool space with the WMS, and then later on moving into the business intelligence or data engineering space.
It's quite a breadth of things. So, to your based off of your experience, I mean, a lot of people talk about upgrading to these systems, right? But these systems are 50 to 60 years old, realistically, when they were first created. So, uh, what are these upgrades enabling? Obviously, there's structure and tracking which people go after, but uh, considering we live now in 2026 and not in like 1984 when a lot of these systems were built, what are the gaps? Do you think that these systems serve the purpose or serve the needs of today? Are the architecture, for the most part, strong, or do they need complete rethink of how to deal with dirty data and like operational flows and all of these other things, right? Because typically in the supply chain space, what happens is slow growth. It takes 10 years to build trust with certain organizations, and when they finally trust you, the fad is gone, and you're dealing with agentic AI or whatever the next thing is, right? So, in your opinion, how do these like planning systems, WMSs, TMSs, hold up in the modern environment?
Like with the legacy systems, what you'd find is that they struggle quite a bit in terms of like the changing business environment because they're actually not configured for like the current realities of business. And you'd find that you'd have to make custom applications to actually address some of these challenges that they have, but still to interface with the legacy system to ensure that if all the data is effectively correct from the business side. So with the upgrades, some of the companies, I remember we tried to do an upgrade of the planning system, utilizing with one of the big vendors, where they had this new tool with a lot of capabilities that I had mentioned. But when it came to implementation, they were actually not even addressing some of the challenges that the company had identified as they wanted to be resolved. So you find that there's this gap between you have these new tools, but they're actually not actually doing anything that the company actually wants, and also the amount of time it takes to actually implement these new tools. It takes about 2 years to implement, and then after 2 years, even with between implementation, it actually doesn't address some of the challenges or the unique challenges each business is actually trying to resolve at that point in time. So there's a lot of sort of catchphrases or new tools that want to be adopted within the space, but they're actually not addressing some of the challenges businesses actually trying to resolve, particularly from an operational perspective.
Yeah, I was reading a report last night from PwC where they said 89% of executives are not happy with these implementations in supply chain so far. I mean, they don't meet the metrics that they set out to. So the question is, okay, well, why do you buy a system with so much promise and after the implementation, the 2 years, why do the metrics not line up? Is it a business, again, like to your earlier point, is it a business operations problem? Were they expecting too much in terms of what tech could do? Was it oversold, right? To say, hey, if you go end to end, you can track everything, etc. Your OTIF will be, double digits more better, whatever the number you want to pick, right? Or like your availability will be 300x what it was before. Like, where is the balance there, right? Because I've seen the numbers of like, okay, yeah, there's promise of tech, but then how much of that gets operationalized is often a fraction of that, right? It's never the, hey, I found 100 million and we're going to save all 100 million. It's always like we found 100 million and we're probably going to act on about 3 million. If we're aggressive and really optimistic, maybe we'll get to $10 million in impact. So talk to me on that and your opinions there.
Yeah. We have seen, like in this instance, whereby, let's say, implementation of a new tool has worked, is effectively a vendor being close with the IT team and being close with the operations team within that environment, understanding what the challenges are, refining the solution to cater for those specific needs. That's why, like that WMS implementation, after a while, we were working quite closely with the vendor to resolve some of the challenges, understanding what these operational requirements are, challenging the operations people because also it was a change management issue. But after a while, the system got up and running. So that close collaboration between the various entities, the business was also quite involved within that process, understanding what the key objectives are in terms of sort of resolving these problems. So in the instance of like adopting any new application, the main stakeholders or the people that need to be involved in the decision making, you need to understand like what needs to be achieved based on that vision that the business wants to set, understanding the operational requirements and the constraints that you currently have, having IT people who have a understanding of both the IT landscape that the company has, and also like from a process perspective, because I think that's the missing gap in being able to align all those various stakeholders within that strategic vision to ensure that you're able to hold each other accountable and understand like what needs to be done at that point in time.
To your point, like everybody's looking for that someone who knows my operations but also knows my IT. Where are these people, right? I mean, did you? I know you spent some time at MIT. I mean, is MIT preparing people to be that sort of profile? Is it something that you have to learn on the job? Talk to me about finding these people, right? Because I typically when I tell people who the ultimate person is to solve your problem, it's typically understands your operations, understands your IT, and then also understands what the CFO wants ultimately because they're the ones writing the check. But where are these people is the big question, right? I mean, it's hard to find people who grew up in, like, say, the family business who understand the if I do something at this point, this is how it impacts the food on the table, right? And then obviously the IT side, which is, hey, all this cool technology is coming up, but really what is the impact to our business ultimately tied to the bottom line because that's what we're working towards, right? So like I guess the big question is, where are these people? Do they need to be developed? Are they just walking around the street and we're just doing a hard time finding these people and bring them into these sorts of problem sets? What are your opinions on that?
Yeah, but I think the people still need to be developed, particularly coming from, but talk about my instance whereby working for the retailer, because I had a keen interest of understanding processes, understanding how things connect. I sort of got exposed to much more than normally an IT person would get exposed to. So I think there's within IT itself, there's a lack of interest in understanding business processes, the underlying architectures, and how everything integrates together. And that's because you're just responsible for this particular application, and that's your core interest. So with that, companies need to develop like cross-functional teams with a broad understanding, and I think that's also lacking because IT is created as a separate entity or organization with no sort of a collaborative measures in place between the operations, the IT, and the business people, or teams being set up in that way, where you have knowledge transfer between the various people in order to understand like what's happening. So I think that capability needs to be built in within the business, whereby you have different business units, whether it's the planner, the demand planner, whether you have your procurement person with the IT person and the business analyst and your data scientist being able to work on solutions in collaborative manner together in order to ensure that what you're actually doing is the correct thing and is able to bring business value.
So to your point, right? You mentioned the on rather than just focusing on the applications, aren't most computer scientists, and maybe my impression is wrong, but aren't they by default systems engineers because they have to set up databases and map it? Because I know systems engineers do a little bit of computer science. In a lot of academic programs, they sort of go back and forth when typically when they're trying to figure out what their major should be. A lot of them just stop being computer scientists, end up being system engineers. So, your thoughts there, like if computer scientists have some background into systems engineering, right? Why is there not as much interest in going back to those roots, right? And saying, hey, like we need to engineer the system, than just saying, hey, we were only going to focus on this application and make sure that's 99.9% functional based off of how we bought it.
Um, I think the incentives in IT, like we mentioned before, it's like the uptime, the availability, and the ability to think through across the board within various teams because it impacts also various stakeholders, even within the IT organization. Some of the challenges or some of the feedback when I've been trying, say for instance, in one particular instance, I was trying to implement something and I understood that it impacted a different system. When I engaged that manager, they told me it's not my place. So you always have these challenges within the organizations itself, with cultures sort of want to be siloed, not collaborative in that sense, and hence people just stick to their own system and engineer their own system without actually a broad understanding of the entire system applications that you're trying to implement within the organizations and how they actually um, interact with one another, and also how they're able to bring value to the business and also how it actually goes within the operational space.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this forever, right? Which is just like it has to culturally align at the top. You need to have a strong leader who sort of says, look, you all sort of work towards the same true north, which is you're all responsible for fulfilling demand at the end of the day, right? Being more responsive to demand, fulfilling more of the demand, right? If that is the true north, why doesn't everybody get that? So talk to me about the gaps in the ecosystem that you see, right? Which is like everybody knows that, hey, we're all in fulfillment, regardless of if you're doing on the production side or whatever. But like, what are the gaps that need to be filled to get people aligned to say, hey, we this is how we all march towards the same goal?
Um, some of the gaps can be filled is sort of realigning as incentives, because from IT's perspective, it's just reducing incidents, trying to solve problems within your own space, which is mainly related to going into the back end, understanding the code, and just making adjustments. Once you're able to set up product teams in that space to be able to achieve this is for the business, this is what you're trying to achieve as a business, we need to align on these measures as the business, and how do you actually collaborate as this product team or unit from the IT perspective, from the business perspective, from the operational side, and also like the data side, then you'd be able to sort of achieve certain goals as a business because you have a better understanding. Because it's one thing is like there's a lack of knowledge sharing within the organization, and once you set up those teams in a collaborative manner, you should have knowledge share. People understand like what's happening in the other space. You have an appreciation of what it takes to actually achieve your goal set. So I think that's really quite important as organizations and having that voice from the C-suite level, because most instances what you find is that the C-suite is just concerned about making profitability. They don't have also have like a understanding of like the operational realities that are there, and also the constraints from operations to IT and what they're actually able to achieve in that instance.
Yeah, typically in the US, and I'll get to 2 points you mentioned, right? So what I've realized is a lot of the constraints are financial. They're put by the CFO at the top saying, this is our budget, make it work, this is what we're going to spend. And then the rest is all engineering, right? And part of engineering is making things work within the cost budgets that you have, right? That's the whole point of engineering, versus saying, hey, theoretically we could build anything, but realistically we only have this much money to build X, right? So you mentioned knowledge sharing. So talk to me about going to college and advanced degrees for this, because I know you ended up with Unzer at MIT doing these courses. There's a large portion of the supply chain and logistics industry that says, "Hey, we're from the School of Hard Knocks. We spent 35 years backing up a truck or running a warehouse or running manufacturing, you name it, oil and gas, field operations." And they're like, "Yeah, we don't really need to go to school." But then there's obviously value to like going and finding some of these structures. So talk to me about that, because you sort of grew up in a retail environment, ran into operations, and went to academia. What did you get out of academia the couple of years you were there?
From academia, I think there was a lot of knowledge sharing because you have business people coming from the business side and also like from IT side or the data side. You had older people, young people with a lot of ideas on how to resolve problems. So within that space, with people from different industries, we were able to get different perspectives, share an open environment in terms of how do you resolve certain challenges. So it was an open space for sharing ideas, challenging ideas, which actually opens your mind to different solutions. So that education environment actually helped foster an environment whereby you communicate ideas, you're able to understand and appreciate different perspectives. And then you're able to incorporate this within your own space to see like how can I utilize this different perspective from the different challenges I've faced in the past. So it was quite important. Like it's quite a nice space in order to uh, you can leverage to actually build yourself, understand what's happening. Also, that network is quite important. Even after varsity, where you're able to reach out to people if you're facing different challenges. So it was quite an important space in terms of like the knowledge sharing and being able to foster different ideas and grow as an individual.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, as you've seen in our space, right? There's just different ways of doing things, and people are sort of stuck in their ways, or they just feel this is the right way to do it, and that's it, right? So compare that to like executive roundtables, because you've been part of probably of those as well, right? With on the corporate side, um, knowledge sharing obviously has its value, right? Because you can finally see, hey, if there's a industry that is actually doing it already, can we just borrow from it? And unfortunately, supply chain logistics, it's not a lot of, hey, well, we'll test it out. It's really like if someone else is doing it, then we'll try it, right? Which is why it
Mm.
takes 40, 50 years for like some of these companies to come to maturity and say, hey, we're a planning system now and the preferred planning system. So this maybe compare and contrast like your typical corporate roundtable to like an academic setting, right, where everybody is there to solve the logistics or supply chain problem. How is it different?
Um, I think the main difference, like within the corporate space, is the one who brings the biggest revenue gets the final say.
Yeah.
So effectively, if a business, even if you have discussions, I remember we were trying to implement sort of metrics for a planning solution. The one had the loudest voice, effectively having that discussion, understanding like what are these metrics, what are we trying to measure. Um, the people who had brought the biggest revenue in the room were the deciding factor, even though there's various opinions which they're unable to listen to, because like we're the ones who actually impact the bottom line the most in the business. So that's sort of like the different perspective, because in the business world, it's like we bring the biggest margins for this company. So we decide what actually needs to be measured for the entire group, regardless of your perspective.
Yeah, I mean that works in all companies, right? Either you bring the biggest investment or you bring the biggest sales ticket, right? And then that basically drives the business. So unfortunately, in a world where it's all sales driven, and again, it's ultimately demand driven, right? From that
Mm.
perspective, because sales is supposed to create the demand, and then your people are supposed to fulfill demand. What is the balance, right? Because the way it works is, someone will build a prototype, it'll test, they'll go sell it and say, hey, this thing works, and suddenly you have 3 years of backlog, right? Saying, hey, we need this, we like it, and then they have no idea of like how to manufacture and run the supply chain for that. So what is the balance there? Because obviously in the corporate world, it's all about, to your point, hey, like if you have the ability to go sell the next 3 years out and the customer understands they have a backlog, by all means, we don't care. Just you go do that. But then what is the balance on supply chain and operations side to say, hey, this is like what we need to do to appropriately scale up, and say the demand just disappears, which nobody really cares about, then how do you manage the certain downfall? Because I saw this a lot in the oil and gas, where it's just like, oh, oil is going to be $200 a barrel, let's just keep going, and then it's not, it's $50 a barrel, and then half the industry is washed out. So
Like how to balance that would be, I think there's sort of needs to be a reorganization of how we approach product development effectively, or having like test phases for products instead of like committing to a solution prior, being able to sort of have teams which you able within a month or two test solutions that you're actually trying to develop, see if this one works, and be able to adapt, being much more adaptable within an organization in terms of the challenges that you face or the applications that you need to bring on board. Because effectively, what you're trying to see is, are we able to reach our objectives of profitability, retaining margin, whatever the metric you're using to measure, in a quick way without actually having delays within your IT systems implementations or committing to a long-term project. So I think that's the main thing, being able to be able simulating environments in order to see, is this actually working from my perspective? Is this working? Are you able to adopt this? And does it work in sort of a simulated environment or with real world data from a pilot's perspective? Because I think having that test out there, being able to have teams that are able to test various perspectives with real world data that you have, actually can influence decision makers to drive like, this is actually the best solution. Because I don't think we utilize some of the tools that we have in our hand optimally to drive those decisions.
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, simulations. It's hard. Again, we could do the simulations, but it's really on the business leaders to understand like what the consequences are of like fulfilling 5x demand just on promises that, hey, well, if there is a need, we will make you whatever you need, right? But to your point, I think one of the things we haven't talked about in terms of accelerating meeting that demand is AI, right? So what is the reality from your side, from the IT operations, retail, chemicals, like, and we could go into what you're working on these days, but like, how much AI is going on? How much of it is just optimization? Is it just a dirty data problem? Like, what is your view of everything going on in supply chain, or maybe just your niche, right? Which is a lot of talk about AI. Like, where is it being used? Where is it successful? Where is it not successful? Where I'm seeing more of. Over to you on that.
I think there's a lot of talk organization wanting to adopt AI, particularly in their processes within their supply chain. But I remember like working in the chemical manufacturing space. One of the challenges that I saw was actually people do not know where to actually utilize this AI tool that they have. I remember in one instance, there was a problem set that was brought to me, and they were trying to utilize AI for about 4 months, which has actually we hadn't worked prior to me. And after looking at the process and what they were trying to achieve, I mentioned this is not an AI problem. You can simply automate this process using basic procedures on your end. So I think what you find within organizations with AI, there's a huge drive for people to utilize AI within their operational space or planning space. How to utilize this? But effectively, they're trying to implement a solution that can actually, without actually understanding what is this problem set. Is it actually for AI, or is it actually for a different solution? So I think there's a lack of thinking around what solutions can we adopt with AI, and what solutions are actually, if it's just a standard process, this is a simple thing that you can actually implement with the standard process without actually utilizing AI, which has also a huge cost impact to the business with those for your schools. So you find multiple people utilize creating their own agents, running amok, but now who's actually a custodian of that data? If people leave, how do you actually ensure this thing is actually working as expected? What happens if a new person comes? Would they still be able to utilize this tool or agent that you've created? So there's a lot of challenges related to that. and also understanding what is like the actual return on investment for this. Should you actually be spending time on things that actually don't bring value to your business in that instance? So I think there's a sort of a misalignment in terms of people wanting to adopt AI but not understanding where should they actually utilize this AI to actually bring the business value. Because in most instances, it's not actually being implemented on the operational data, but it's implemented around how teams work.
Very good point. And to your point, which I've heard for first time in a while, which is that people are training up AI based off of the person who's training it up, right? But that doesn't mean that the next co-pilot that comes along or whoever else has to use the AI will be able to effectively use that AI because that AI was trained on the knowledge and the constraints of whoever trained that AI, right? So to your point, right? It's not being used as much on the operational data. It should be used more for it should be used for more for other things. But what I'm seeing is mostly back office stuff, right? Which is a
Yes.
create a PowerPoint faster for me. I don't want to read this 3,000 page RFP. Give me a 2 page summary and tell me if this is the cheapest, right? So those are like the things that it's being used for. But where should it be used for, in your opinion? From to improve the retail environment, etc. Besides like getting people to collaborate better, some of the use cases we see is just like, hey, making sure they're entering the data properly and almost like a Grammarly for operations, right? To say if you put in the wrong number or wrong context, that someone just sort of slaps your hand and says, hey, put it in properly. That's been useful enough to improve the demand signal, believe it or not, the supply signal in locations. But what do you see as the best use cases of AI today, right? That anybody in retail or operations, chemicals, wherever you've been, can use to improve their overall productivity or at least the business value that the organization is looking for, which according to PwC, 89% of these executives are not getting it based off of what they signed up for.
Yeah. The biggest upside that I've seen of AI is particularly sort of in the knowledge management or knowledge transfer space. People being able to, from operations perspective, being able to enter a prompt to the AI with the knowledge documents that actually exist in the organization from their process flows to understand what's actually happening. What should I happen? What should happen here? What's the process here? And the AI being able to provide like the relevant documentation, feeding back into that system. So I think it works fundamentally well as that collaborative agent whereby you're able to have all these documents sitting across the organization. You have it in that repository. You're able to prompt it to like, this is the specific issue I'm facing. How can I resolve it? Well, what's happening here? And it is able to bring that data or essentially back to the user without actually spending too much time going back to IT. Like this is spending 3 days trying to resolve an issue. Now you effectively have that tool be able to provide a quick response to address certain challenges even within the operational environment.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so, talk to me about. So, you've done pretty much the corporate side, the academic side, the business, the family business side. I believe you're doing your own thing now, right? So, talk to me about what you're up to these days and what triggered that transition.
So what I'm up to these days, I sort of work as an independent consultant. I tried particularly like within the data space. So currently work trying to design data architectures for companies, data engineering, and also like data problems, understanding their processes, working on their business proposals in terms of supply chain strategies, and how to set that up. So I just work as a business consultant. So just based on my experience, the reason I chose the shift was effectively I found that as an independent consultant or external person, you have greater influence within different organizations. Having to work in an organization, whether you have all these different perspectives, it's quite challenging being the voice that actually brings everyone together. But the voice from an independent consultant with your experience or expertise, it's much more appreciated in order to sort of move the needle forward in terms of implementing solutions. So I think that was been the major driving force for me moving to the independent consultant space, but also trying to work on different projects, having a greater impact with the skills that I have from various organizations, sort of staying in one organization, which would sort of limit my impact across the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to put you in an organization, and because you have so many different like experiences and capabilities, right? Where typically big corporations are like, hey, you do this little piece and you do it really well, and that's basically it, right? So to your point, right? One of the things that I've noticed with you is you've decided to focus on the back end side, the data architecture, data engineering, setting up the data, setting up the pipes, versus what's much more popular right now, which is go sell whatever AI tool that you can go and implement, right? So what made you go into do the boring stuff, right? Which is often the slower race, but obviously that's the race that scales versus saying, hey, this is the age of AI. I have all this experience in supply chain and IT. Why don't I go AI heavy? And maybe scale up some sort of, I don't know, copilot tool for the warehouse or something along those lines that you could clearly build very quickly. But you decided instead to do the data engineering, data architecture, and all the backend stuff, which seems to be the realities of what a lot of organizations actually need. I would say about 90% today, versus like, hey, here's Gemini, and it can act like a, I don't know, like a warehouse agent.
Yeah, moving into that space, the main factor that made me move into majority focus on that, I think most corporates or businesses, they have sufficient data to make good decisions, but the thing is, how do you engineer the data within a quick turnaround to bring those good decisions to reality? Trying to like try to moved away from implementing systems. This is a new tool that you need. This is a UI, because what I found was it majority of times it doesn't address the solution or the issue at a problem statement at hand. And also sometimes the company has sufficient data to actually drive good decisions within the corporation. But then how do you engineer that data coming from different flows? Do you need, because I don't think you need a big data warehouse in certain instances to bring everything together, but how with the current technology or tech that you have, how you're able to bring those different informational flows, which are coming at different times, and to make effective decisions as an organization. And I think one of the biggest things is within the data engineering space, how to able to develop that space to move forward in order to incorporate some of that data into that decision making.
Yeah, it makes sense. And to your point, right? So obviously, there's the right way and the wrong way. I don't know which one's which anymore, but the way the operation should be addressing the issue is, like you said, is like there's good data that needs to be tied to decisions. It needs to back up the decisions. But what do you do about organizations that take the opposite approach? Like say, hey, like Anthropic, OpenAI, we definitely want to do it. Get us ahead of logistics who can get us to use Anthropic, OpenAI. What within our environment? How would you go about addressing that problem? Which is like, hey, you have this data that can be fed in, or probably should not be fed in, to these systems unless it's behind a firewall and it's the enterprise version. Um, like, what is the approach there, right? Because some of our, unfortunately, like some of the people I run into, they don't want to hear about data engineering, data architecture. They don't want to know that they basically have a swamp of a data lake, right? They just want to say, all right, everybody else is buying Anthropic, OpenAI, Mistral. We need to be on that wagon tomorrow. Make it happen. I don't care how you make it happen, but I want to see something in a chatbot format that is just spewing out information that semi makes sense. And we've all used these agents, and we know the how many mistakes they make and how much time it takes to fix those mistakes and how many tokens it takes. But from that perspective, from what everything you know from IT, from logistics, and now this AI boom that's happening, speak to me about how to approach that side of the world, right? Because unfortunately, people chase the latest, shiniest object. But if
Yeah.
the goal is just, hey, I just want to use this latest, shiniest object, how do you enable that from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I think with that, particularly in the AI space, it's that actually defining that problem statement that you're trying to solve, understanding whether or not does this actually require AI to solve with this agentic agent, or is it something else that's different? Um, then from there, you're able to step back to understand actually what's the business value you're trying to attain by the adoption of this particular technology. Once you're able to address those sort of key points, you should be able to then think through like what process are you actually feeding data into this AI? Is it actually secure data? What are you actually doing? Is it you want a sandbox in your own company, like what are the rules around this? What are you actually feeding? And also, is there effectively you sending data into an agent? Are you trying to get a summary from it? Like, what are you actually trying to do? And what other capabilities need to surround this agent that you're trying to feed in order to get the outcome that you actually want? So I think having a good architecture of that problem in order to resolve is quite important, and also understanding like what is it, what type of problem it is, and what type of solution is best suited for that particular problem.
But if the goal is just to use AI, what's the fastest way of using AI in logistics and supply chain?
Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of this. So the fastest way is just integrating your data into having accessibility to the AI, where it's
Yeah.
able tables, you effectively like this is the order status, this is what's happening. Then you have built on top application agent, which is able to get that data in. You're able to check like what status this order is and effectively writing summaries, they're able to do that. But then you'd have to add additional checks within your pipeline to ensure like is this actually the correct data, is this the quality pipeline effectively. But yeah, I think being able to connect to a database, being able to read, understand, this is the table, this is the data structure of it, this is what it means, describing that to the AI, being able to then set up the rules in order to ensure that whatever data it brings back, and having those quality checks in place with the confidence to be able to say this is the confidence we have in this particular instance. I see it works quite well in terms of order deliveries, status updates on orders, but in effect, like for decision making, like what should you do next, I don't think it's that impactful.
So what I'm seeing right now in the market, right, is a lot of industrial businesses, PE firms. They're basically what they're doing is they're just taking their spreadsheets, uploading it to Claude, Gemini, and then they're basically using it as a search engine to say, "Hey, find me the outliers," or "Tell me something I don't know about my business." Right. So tell me about the limits of doing that, right? Because right now there's like this entire boom with AI, and that's basically the use case where a lot of I don't want to call them MBAs, but people are just graduating now, coming in consulting. They're just saying, hey, if we can just either build massive repositories, or we can get all these Excel sheets, push it up into an AI system, and we look at the financial statements and whatever information we can find, we can, to your point, standardized report, come up and just write you something really quickly that you can act on. Tell me about the limitations of just taking an Excel sheet and putting it into an AI system, like a Gen AI system. It's the same thing that happened 10 years ago with BI systems, right? Whether it's Watson or Power BI or Tableau, it's like they were uploading it, they were visualizing it, and boom, like maybe you found something, maybe you didn't find something. So speak to me about the limitations of just not doing what you do, right? Which is putting in the logic checks and all that stuff. What if I just take an Excel sheet, boom, like say I got an Excel sheet from some pharmacy, boom, I upload it and say, here's all your outliers. Why can't I just do that? Like, why do I need to do data engineering, data science, all this other stuff?
Yeah. Having discussions with people who actually like from even from the financial services side who actually utilize some of the AI with their reporting, the main challenge you'd find is that the maths doesn't math once you actually upload it to the AI. So there's always these various steps. They have to do additional steps to actually verify actually is this correct? Because the issues with just uploading data, taking what AI says from these are outliers, they actually sometimes provide the incorrect information because effectively it's just a predictive model based like what's the next thing. It doesn't actually inform like the mathematical side on it, and also without understanding like the business process, being able to put those constraints in place due to the limitations of what the actual AI model actually is. It's not a mathematical model, just a predictive model based on the textual reference. It might provide you with the incorrect information, especially if you are not skilled enough or without experience understanding like where these gaps are. You might it might impact like the intended outcomes that you actually want. So you might get incorrect information back. And without being able to spot that, you might feed that into the system, then that might lead to other issues within your supply chain, which has a downside impact on your overall operations without actually understanding why is that the issue in the first instance. where did that incorrect information come from, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain to people, but the current craze is like, hey, I mean, it's always about the status quo, right? It's like if we were not doing anything if we were just doing barely BI with our Excel sheets, and now suddenly we are pulling in the 10K forms and all the public stock prices and tying it to how we're doing it with our system. Suddenly, like AI is a little bit better than what we were doing before, right? So, is it the ideal perfect solution? Probably not. It's a little bit better than the status quo, probably, right? So again, this comes to the conversation around AI slot, where in a supply chain environment, like you mentioned, if the maths don't math and if they don't add up, then you're going to have like this situation where one of our advisors investors called me yesterday saying, hey, like I'm stuck in this online pharmacy issue where they keep sending me 90 of the same pill and I only ask for 30, and they keep sending me 90 every week, and then if I need to resolve it, I have to go to a chatbot, and the chatbot doesn't have a real name, so I'm stuck in this infinite loop of automation. But I can't tell them that, hey, stop sending me 90. I just need 30 of these pills, because obviously I don't want insurance paying for these pills. So I mean, these things are going to continue, but the question is it more valuable to automate and just get the human out of the loop and sort of those sorts of supply chain settings, or long term is the guardrails, the slow build up, the data architecture to make sure that that bot is sending 30 pills consistently, and there's someone who can intervene with that chatbot if the question is not being answered, the way to go, right? This is like the big question. A lot of people, obviously, corporations were like, hey, the less people, the less labor, the less lawsuits, all the better, right? But if you look at like the downside of that from a customer service perspective, what's the balance?
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, what you find is most people, like with the adoption of these tools, is just to reduce their work count in order to increase their profitability. But I think your capacity is the people that you have with the different knowledge that they have. So I think implementing systems incorporate understanding how the decision points that people need to make to drive those decisions, people having to interact and test through like these, let's say, AI solutions. Is it actually the correct data? Why is it making these decisions? That checks and balances actually help improve any system that you're operating. And also, you can deploy your people like various environments whereby you can automate a process, but then to make decisions, there is a sort of a human that actually needs to check. For instance, if there's an outlier here, it's not as expected, or if it's something that's not within a particular range, to be able to understand why is this making this decision, particularly if you're quite connected to understanding the background and the architecture, how things have been designed, where is that failure point, to intervene in order to rectify those failure points to ensure that the system is stable. Stability in the sense of it's producing the outcomes that you want effectively or want to achieve, that you've set for yourself as a business.
Great point, Zukisani. And I know we're coming up on time. So I guess, what are you working on for the next 6 to 12 months? Where do you see the future supply chain going on the IT side, on the operation side, just from where you're sitting, obviously with so much experience working in Europe for American companies as well, now you're in South Africa. Tell me about like how you see different geo markets evolving, right, from an IT, logistics, supply chain, operations perspective, and where the world is headed from where you're sitting.
Yeah. From currently, I'm just working on automating certain processes for a company and also like trying to build a data architecture, data warehouse for a different for certain companies. Just focused on that on the data engineering side. Where I see supply chain growing, I think there's a lot of voices with different perspectives, particularly coming from an engineering background, which have come to influence, particularly with the issues and challenges within the supply chain that we're facing right now, which are coming to the fore. So I think what you'll find is hopefully the voices that are there, they'll have a greater influence and understanding to the C-suite executives in terms of how are supply chains designed? How do you actually ensure flow is there? How do you align with the IT systems? What are the core principles that you actually want to achieve? So hopefully within that space, we'd be able to actually implement and drive solutions that address key problems. Within an African perspective, I think there's a huge drive for manufacturing within the continent, and I think there's a huge gap also. Like, how do you, with that drive, how do you actually implement all these solutions and operational data using AI or whatever tools you would want to utilize to drive effective decisions while creating employment for people or retaining employment? What skill sets are actually required in that instance? What I've seen in the US is effectively there's still a drive for a lot of technologies which are new, which actually don't resolve the problem. But I think there's still a lot of voices which are rising in that side to actually challenge that sort of norm or status quo, whereby I know actually what are you actually trying to do, and also with the better connection between the operation people come from operations, implementing IT systems, and having those conversations with SUSIT executives at a sort of a common level is going to be quite an interesting perspective in sort of driving forth the implementation of like correct solutions for the correct understanding, driving correct solutions for these problems that companies currently have.
Thanks, Zukisani, as always. And just for people who are like listening in, what's the best way to reach out to you? Is it LinkedIn? Is it your email? What's the time zones you prefer to be reached out to as well?
Yeah, no, people can reach out to me via LinkedIn and also via email. My email probably it's Zukisani at essetech.com. Then I'll just post it, send it to you just to post. But effectively, you can reach out to me anytime between 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. South African time.
Thank you, Zukisani, and thank you everyone for attending another session of the Supply and Chain podcast. That's it for now.